What would you do if you were stuck in one place, every day was the same, and nothing really mattered that you did? If you remember back in the 1990s, that was the exact scenario that weatherman Phil Connors found himself in that movie, Groundhog Day. You guys remember that movie, right? Bill Murray plays that main character who relives that day, Groundhog Day, February 2nd, over and over and over in that small Pennsylvania town where these festivals take place. If you do remember this movie, try to think back. Maybe it's been like, for myself, years and years since you have seen this. Ask yourself, what does Phil do to cope with that never-ending prison that he finds himself in? What does he do to try to find meaning when it seems that nothing he does day in and day out really matters? If you remember, he does what many of us in this room, I'm sure, would do as well. He tries to look for happiness. He tries to look for meaning. He tries to look for significance in all sorts of different experiences in that day that seems to never end. He begins by looking to hedonistic pleasures. He denies himself nothing. If it feels good, he does it. He'll try it. He'll try anything. There's one scene in the movie, if you remember, where he's at the diner and he gorges himself on this table full of food. He's drinking coffee straight from the pot because nothing really matters. He's not going to gain any weight. There's going to be no health ramifications or so forth. Later in the movie, he knocks out a guy because he annoys him. He tries to seduce women. He just goes on and on, these hedonistic pleasures, thinking, well, maybe if I have these experiences, that will make this never-ending prison have some sort of meaning. Well, then when that fails to work, he turns to greed. You remember he robs an armored car and uses that money to buy himself a wardrobe of the clothes that he had always wanted. And over again, this doesn't work either. And when this fails to work, when this fails to provide meaning, fails to provide purpose, he then turns to despair. He tries to take his life multiple times throughout the movie. But what happens every time? Again, he wakes up February 2nd in that same Pennsylvania town. Finally, he tries to turn to knowledge. He takes up the piano, ice sculpting, French poetry, on and on, thinking, well, maybe if I become a well-rounded man, there will be some sort of meaning to this monotonous, never-ending day that I find myself in. If you remember, Phil doesn't end up waking up on February 3rd until he finally reaches contentment within his current circumstances. It's not until he has really accepted where he is that the curse is finally lifted. That last time he relives that cursed day of February 2nd, he looks into the eyes of the woman he's fallen in love with and says, I don't know what will happen today. All I know is I'm happy right now. Well, this is sort of the point of the book of Ecclesiastes. Matt Chandler puts it like this: life is more like Groundhog Day than we care to admit. Another author puts it like this: we are stuck in a monotonous prison where nothing we do really changes anything. And the only way to live a meaningful life in this meaningless existence is to find satisfaction and contentment in what God has given us. Well, if this is true, if life is a little bit more like Groundhog Day than we care to admit, if we are stuck in what seems like a monotonous prison day in and day out, well, how is it then that we find meaning? How is it that we find purpose in this life? That has to be one of the best setups for a new book study, the History of Grace Bible Church. Aren't you excited for the next 9 weeks, walking through this monotonous prison that we're in? You know, if we're honest, though, most of us have felt this sort of drain, this sort of monotony, this sort of drudgery in the day in and day out life that we find ourselves in. And if we're extra honest this morning, and we're in church, we're supposed to be honest, right? If we're extra honest this morning, most of us have asked that same question as Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, and this same question that the author of Ecclesiastes is asking us this morning. What's the point? What is the point in any of this? Well, this morning, like I said, we're going to begin this journey, a 9-week journey, walking through this often neglected book of Ecclesiastes. It's not a very long book. It's not a very short book. It's not just a few chapters. It is 12 chapters. But it's not a very long book. It's 12 chapters that are a God-inspired account of one man's musings and struggles through finding the meaning of life, finding the point of life, finding the point of anything. I think a lot of us, myself included, are often tempted to shy away from this book because if we're honest, we don't quite know what to do with it, right? We can find ourselves on the one hand agreeing with the author a little bit more than we care to admit. And it puts us in a little more vulnerable and a little more open and raw and honest state than we care to be. Or we find ourselves really not being able to connect with the struggles of this preacher at all. And so we don't really quite know how to handle it. Well, I hope that after this morning and through the next 9 weeks, we will find this book not to be a drudgery for us, not to be a pessimistic, down and out and book of despair, but I hope that we find this book to be a source of great wisdom for us. A book inspired by God, included in his canon. A life-giving book that God has given us to help to expose the lies of this world and the lies of our flesh that we're so often tempted to believe that we can find meaning and we can find happiness and we can find fulfillment in anything in this world, in this life under the sun. I hope that you'll see through these 12 chapters that the author of Ecclesiastes is going to dash that falsehood to a million pieces. And as he does, as he shows us that there's nothing in this world that can ultimately satisfy us, that there's nothing in this world that can provide ultimate meaning, he's going to do so to drive us in a way to find that our only true meaning, the only true way to find meaningless and happiness and joy and fulfillment is a life that is focused on God's glory in Christ. So I want to begin by reading the introduction to the book. We're actually going to look at the introduction in the first 18 verses, and then we're going to flip to the conclusion and see the last 6 verses as we get a full orb picture of where this book is going to take us. So follow along with me. I'm going to read our passage in whole, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south, goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it can be said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. There's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It's an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I've seen everything that's done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made right, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were here over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Now fast forward to the end of the book, chapter 12, beginning in verse 8. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. all is vanity. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. It's a lot for us to cover this morning, but I hope that it gives us just a grand, big overview of the book and where we're going. Let me first offer you a brief introduction to this book. We're not given an explicit name by the author as to who exactly wrote this book, but we do have some context clues like there in verse 1. He introduces himself as the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Later in verse 12, he speaks of having been king over Israel in Jerusalem. And again in verse 16, he says that he has acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And putting all these pieces together, I think that we can say, well, it's already up there for you, I think that we can say that the author is probably Solomon. This is the majority position throughout the history of the church, that it's actually King Solomon, son of David, who is responsible for the writing of this book of Ecclesiastes. And there's been a lot of scholarly work over the last decades and even centuries examining the inner structure of the book and suggesting other authors other than Solomon. In reality, whether Solomon wrote this book or someone else, it doesn't really change the meaning of the book. But for me, Solomon really seems to be the best candidate and really the only candidate, as he was the only one of David's sons who ruled over united Israel from Jerusalem. He was the one, if you remember, from the book of 1 Kings, who received wisdom beyond anyone who had ever had wisdom as he asked God for this, and God granted his desire. And so we have much of Solomon's wisdom penned for us, included in the writings of God's word, much of the Proverbs and Song of Solomon, and I believe here in the book of Ecclesiastes. But again, he doesn't explicitly say the words of the preacher, the son of David, King Solomon. Rather, he just identifies himself here as the preacher. Or the Hebrew word, perhaps you've heard, and I told the men yesterday, our men's study, I'm only going to say this word once because I struggle to say it. I'm not going to use it throughout, but koheleth, I believe is how we say this. Koheleth, keheleth, quoheleth, however you say it. Koheleth is that Hebrew word here that he identifies himself as the preacher. So what then is this book about? Well, in short, it is a wisdom book. It's written in a style that you'd expect from a person as he kind of comes to the end of his life, reflecting on life's circumstances, reflecting on life's experiences, written to communicate clear truth that seeking meaning and satisfaction in this life and anything in this earth is a vain exercise. And so the main point we could say is that everything is meaningless apart from finding one's meaning in God and in Him alone. Centuries ago in the 1600s, there was a pastor, reformer, theologian, John Calvin. He opened his book, his Institutes of the Christian Religion, his famous systematic theology, speaking of how we as humans discover wisdom by means of what he called a double knowledge, a knowledge of God on the one hand and a knowledge of ourselves on the other. He begins with these words, that famous book, nearly all the wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of these two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. Well, this book of Ecclesiastes then provides us with that second means of knowledge. This book of Ecclesiastes helps us to gain a better understanding of who we are as sinners, as who we are as created beings, as humans. One author puts it like this: in Ecclesiastes, God intends you to know him by requiring you to look plainly and without polish at yourself, your neighbors, and the world in which you and I live. We are, as Calvin goes on to say, prompted by our own ills to contemplate the good things of God. And so Ecclesiastes then confronts us with our own ills in order that we might turn our gaze and turn our direction to come to know God as who he is. Verse 2 here in chapter 1, the author gives us, Solomon gives us, what I think is the main point of the entire book. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He uses this superlative, vanity of vanities, in the same way that Hebrew writers used the Holy of Holies. When the Hebrew writers would use superlatives in this sort of way, the Holy of Holies was a way of saying this is the most holy place in the entire universe. This is the most holy place that you could imagine. And so in using this sort of superlative language, vanity of vanities, it's the preacher's way of saying it's as vain as possible. Everything is as meaningless as it could be. Now, what exactly is meant here by this word vanity, which is the Hebrew word havel, Hevel? The ESV translates it vanity. I believe the NASB does as well. Some translations use meaningless. Some translations use other ones. But this is a word that is used 30 times throughout this book. Now, the word can mean 4 different things. Number 1, it can mean vain, meaningless, or futile. Obviously, that's what the ESV has chosen. Number 2, it's a word that can mean irrational or senseless or absurd. It's a word that thirdly can mean transient, temporary, fleeting. Or number 4, it can mean mysterious, incomprehensible, enigmatic. I think as I was studying this week and reading a long article just on the meaning of this word, I thought about Solomon's words there that we just read in chapter 12, verse 12, that of making many books there is no end, and of much study there is weariness of the flesh. I think we could also say of the writing of articles on the meaning of havel there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. You know, we can get trapped in the weeds here on exactly what this word means. I think that there's a sense in which all of these options are included in the meaning of this word. It's a word that literally means breath, means vapor. It carries this idea of something that's of a fleeting nature. It's kind of like when you go out and breathe on a cold day. You see your breath just for a moment, and then what happens? It's just kind of gone. You see it no more. It's that same idea that James is getting at when he speaks of our life as a mist that's here today and vanishes tomorrow. Solomon gives here his thesis statement in verse 2, saying that all is havel, havel of havels, vanity of vanities. He's expressing this idea that everything under the sun, that is life on this earth, is meaningless. It's pointless. It's worthless. It's mysterious because it's all frail and it's all fleeting. I like this quote by the atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell. I appreciate his honesty in this quote, as depressing as it is. He writes of this sort of reality of life under the sun, quote, again, remember this is an atheist, "We stand on the shore of an ocean, crying to the night and the emptiness. Sometimes a voice answers out of the darkness, but it's a voice of one drowning, and in a moment the silence returns. The world seems to me quite dreadful. The unhappiness of most people is very great, and I often wonder how they all endure it. To know people well is to know their tragedy. It's usually the central thing about which their lives are built. And I suppose if they did not live most of the time in the things of the moment, they would not be able to go on." This atheist philosopher is expressing a bit of the truth of what Solomon is communicating here in Ecclesiastes. If this world is all that there is, if this life under the sun is the only existence that we have and all that we're living for, it's vanity of vanities, because it's all fleeting and it will all be gone in a moment. Like children that don't say thank you for Christmas or birthday presents, so many of us in this world seek to worship the gifts of this world, the gifts of the giver, rather than the giver himself. God has granted us with so much beauty, so much goodness, so many things in this world, good things like pleasure and sex and money and stuff and so forth. Some of them are good and fine, but we seek to find lasting satisfaction. We seek to find ultimate meaning in those things. All of those things are not necessarily bad things, but when we look to those good things given to us by our Creator God and seek to turn them into kind of quasi-godlike things, seeking to find our ultimate joy and satisfaction and happiness in them, that is where we have run amok. And that is where we will find over and over the truth of verse 2, vanity of vanities. Well, as we continue and as we consider this introductory section, we're going to do so by having three main points this morning that we'll see in these verses. Number one, everything is meaningless because all of our activity is pointless. Secondly, everything is meaningless because nothing satisfies. And finally, our frustration in the meaninglessness of everything is meant to drive us to Christ. So first, let's look at verses 3 through 11 and see that everything is meaningless because all of our activity is pointless. Look at how he begins the section in verse 3 by asking a question that's meant to prove his point of verse 2. Verse 2, thesis statement, vanity of vanities. Now, verse 3, question, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? He's asking this question, what's the point? What's the point of it all? As we look at it all, what is the net gain here? A key phrase to note here is that phrase that's going to be used 30 times throughout this book is that phrase that he says at the end of verse 3, at which he toils under the sun. This is an important phrase because it sets the context for Solomon's investigation. It means here that he is looking at this question of meaning from an earthly perspective. If this world is all there is, if there is no God, if there is no afterlife, if there is no final judgment, then what's the point of everything? And he's going to conclude everything is meaningless. The late pastor W.A. Criswell said it like this: you look at time and tide and history, and it brings you to infinite despair. Solomon here in verse 3 is asking that same question that Jesus asks in Mark 8:36. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? If you give everything for this life, for that which is considered life under the sun, what's the point? What's the profit? What is the net gain? You know, the thing that I love about the book of Ecclesiastes is that for 11 and a half chapters of this book, all the way down to that final section that we read at the end of chapter 12, Solomon is going to push the unbeliever, push the skeptic, the worldly person to the logical conclusion of their position. In that sense, it's really an excellent apologetic book, isn't it? It's really an excellent evangelistic book for us to share the good news of the gospel and the good news of God with those in this world. It's as if Solomon starts with their starting point and says, okay, let's examine that worldview then. Let's truly examine it and drive it all the way to its conclusion. And his conclusion is that if life under this sun is all that we have, it is a depressing existence because it is vanity of vanities. He's going to go on after asking this question in verses 4 through 11 into a poem that points to the repetitive cycles of nature that prove the point of verse 3. Verse 4, he points us to the cycle of generations. A generation comes, generation goes, but the earth remains forever, person after person, generation after generation. The earth continues, generations return to dust, on and on the cycle goes. Then in verses 5 through 8, we get three examples where human experience mirrors natural cycles. In verse 5, he compares the sun to the exhausted track runner who just runs lap after lap after lap, thinking he's going somewhere. but in the end, he's just running in circles. Verse 6, he paints a picture of the wind doing the same. There's all sorts of activity, but what actually changes? Verse 7, he gives the cycle of the oceans. All of the streams of the earth run into the sea, but the water levels remain the same. There's no net change. There's no net gain. The task is never done, he's pointing us to. It just repeats itself over and over and over. There's no completion. There's no satisfaction. There's no finality and completion in life under the sun. The universe, Solomon says, is trapped in this meaningless cycle, ultimately never accomplishes anything. And he says human experience mirrors that in that way. And listen, even those of us as believers this morning who have a right focus on Christ, who have a right focus on God in our life, listen, we too can feel the frustration of this monotony of life, can't we? Just think about you go home perhaps this evening, you walk into the kitchen, look at the sink. What's in the sink? A sink full of dishes, right? You do the dishes, you put them all in the dishwasher, you put them away, you cook dinner, you put the kids to bed, you go back into the kitchen, and what's in the sink again? A sink full of dishes. Or you do laundry. Laundry's the one that gets me, right? You wash the laundry, you separate the laundry, you fold the laundry, you put the laundry up, and before you turn around, it all has to be done again. These are the facts of life for us. Bills, emails, haircuts, mowing the grass, it seems to never end. And sometimes people don't know how to deal with this, do they? Different people have their own ways of trying to break free from this monotony. Some are fine and harmless, but then others end up having some sort of midlife crisis or running into affairs or some sort of radical in-the-moment career shift. All of it simply trying to break free of that monotony and that dissatisfaction of their lives. People are, as the preacher here in Ecclesiastes says, simply chasing after the wind. And Solomon concludes here in verse 8 that our existence under the sun is full of weariness. He says we can't say enough, we can't see enough, we can't hear enough. There's no amount of words that can break this monotony. There's no level of perfect vision. There's nothing you can hear. It's as the Rolling Stones put it, no matter how hard we try, we can't get no satisfaction. It's just on and on and on. Our desires are never fully satisfied. We may find a measure of happiness, but we're never fully content. We always want more. We think if we could just get that promotion, if I could just get that bigger house in that better neighborhood, if I could just get that newer phone or that bigger TV or that nicer car, then I will have arrived. We keep waiting for a change in our circumstances to make it better for us. And then that change comes, and we realize that change doesn't satisfy us. We think the next change is going to satisfy us. And it's this on and on cycle over and over. Just think back to how you grew up and how we see so many grow up. When you're a kid, you think things will be better when you become a teenager, right? When you're a teenager, you think things will become better when you turn 18, and then everything will fall into place, and you'll have life's meaning figured out. And you turn 18, you realize that didn't happen. You think maybe at 21, right? And then in your 20s, you think, well, maybe once I get married and have kids, then I'll really discover the true purpose of my life. I'll really find that full satisfaction that I've been lacking for so long. Then you get married and have kids, and you realize, well, that didn't happen. You think, well, maybe once I raise them and get them out of the house, then I'll retire, and that's where I'll really find the satisfaction that I am going to feel. Over and over again, life stage comes, life stage goes, and you just keep looking forward to what's next, thinking that some other change of circumstances will actually change anything at all. But it's never enough. It never fulfills. It never fully satisfies. I'll never forget the Tom Brady interview back in 2005 with 60 Minutes. 2005, this is right after Brady had won his third Super Bowl ring. This is something that few quarterbacks in history had ever done at that point. And yet, even though he had reached kind of the pinnacle of success at his young age, he was wrestling with the very thing that the preacher in Ecclesiastes was wrestling with here. He was wrestling with this question, is this really it? Is this all that it was cracked up to be? He says in that interview, quote, "Why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me. I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, hey man, this is what it is. I reached my goal, my dream, my life. But I think, God, it's got to be more than this. I mean, this can't be what it's all cracked up to be. That's the point that Solomon is making for us here in the introduction. He goes on to make it even more clear as he ends the section, verses 9 through 11, telling us there's nothing new under the sun. Now listen, sure, there are technological advances and so forth on smaller scales, but in the large scheme of things, through the ages, nothing really ultimately changes. It's as Alistair Begg puts it so well when he says, yes, we put a man on the moon, but there was nothing for him to do there except stare back at the earth. Right? The fundamental events of life remain the same. Birth, marriage, family, work, and death. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And Solomon's making this point here that the human race is still the same bunch of sinners that it has always been, and nothing we have done really makes a difference in that regard. So everything is meaningless because all of our activity is pointless, Solomon says. Secondly, everything is meaningless because nothing satisfies. Solomon now moves from what he has observed in nature to what we can learn from his actual experiences in life. He's going to go through the rest of the book giving us a bit of a personal testimony of how he tries everything and nothing satisfies. He's going to try money, it doesn't work. He's going to try success, it doesn't work. He's going to try fame, it doesn't work. He's going to try wisdom, it doesn't work. Over and over again, he's going to give himself to say, will this finally satisfy me? And over again, he's going to conclude with that same phrase, it's all vanity, vanity of vanities. Look at verse 12. He says, I, the preacher, have been king over Jerusalem, over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. That's kind of, he's preparing you for where he's going. I've done everything, right? It's an unhappy business, he says, that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I've seen everything that's done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. Have you guys ever been out on a nice spring or summer day? I know those of you with kids will recognize what I'm talking about. Maybe you think back when you had young kids. You go out on a nice spring, summer day, and you turn the bubble machine on, right? You turn the bubble machine on, and your kids are just chasing those bubbles. They're trying to pop the bubbles. They're trying to catch the bubbles. Well, what happens as they chase after those bubbles? Well, most of them end up floating away and popping out of their grasp, right? Others, they try to grab, they get close enough, and they go to grab it, and it pops. And every now and again, they'll catch one, right? Every now and again, one will fall on their hand, and they'll catch it, and they ooh and ah, and they come up and show you, hey, Mom, Dad, look at this. But then what happens? Poof, it pops. It's gone just as soon as it was there. This is the picture that Solomon is painting for us here when he speaks of striving after the wind. Our efforts in this fallen world are like trying to catch the wind in our hands. Just think about if one of you went out in the parking lot after service today and you're just trying to catch the wind, right? You look like a madman out in the parking lot. Someone asks you what you're doing. I'm just trying to catch the wind. You'd look like an utter fool, right? It would be a fool's errand. It's a vain effort. That is what Solomon is pointing us to here. You see, when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, humanity from that time unto this very day departed from God's design. And as a result, God has imposed a curse on the world. That curse, we see it given in Genesis 3. We see it explained further by Paul in Romans 8 regarding its effect even on the creation itself, not just on us as human beings. It means that everything is broken in our world. Everything is broken in our lives. And in our brokenness, we turn to pleasures, we turn to possessions, we turn to status, we turn to relationships, we even turn to vain religion, trying to fix what is broken, and we find that all of it is futile striving after the wind. And so Solomon, in all of his status as king, all of his status as the wisest man in the earth, he's going to give himself to all that his riches can afford him. He's going to put this to the test. And in so doing, he's going to show us how vain is everything in this earth. So what is the purpose of this book in our lives? What is the purpose of this book? Why in the world do you think God included these 12 chapters in his canon of his inerrant, sufficient word? And why are we spending 9 weeks walking through this book as God's people? Well, I put a rather lengthy quote for you because I wanted you to read it and hear it and soak it in. It's there on your handout. I'm going to put it on the screen. But listen to how one author answers this. He says, "The American dream is a lie and a failure. We live in a culture with more money, more entertainment, more pleasurable experiences, more recreation, and more stuff than any previous generation could have ever dreamed, and pain pills and antidepressants fly over the counters of our pharmacies. It's a miserable world where one of the funniest and richest men in the world has ever seen, Robin Williams, kills himself in despair. Ecclesiastes gives a bleak look on life, but the Spirit had a purpose for inspiring this book to be written. He wants to expose the meaninglessness of life in a cursed world in order to create a hunger for something better. Ecclesiastes wants to push us to faith and contentment in God. The Holy Spirit inspired Ecclesiastes to convict you of your own meaninglessness in your current existence in order to make you wise for salvation through Jesus Christ." So that leads us to our final point this morning, which is that all our frustration in the meaninglessness of everything is meant to drive us to Christ. And I hope you see that week in and week out as we look at topic after topic as being meaningless apart from Christ. We'll see that if you pursue that thing in your life, you will find that it is vanity of vanities. But if you let the lack of satisfaction in that draw you to your need for Christ, you will find meaning in everything that God has blessed you with. You see, the book of Ecclesiastes cannot be rightly understood without its conclusion. The bleak outlook of the quest that Solomon's going on is only properly understood as he wraps it up there in verse 12. Remember, he said in verse 8, he repeats again his thesis, all is vanity, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. But then he ends with these words in verses 13 and 14. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or bad. You see, the entire point of Solomon's book of Ecclesiastes is to show that it's only those who fear God and who walk in wisdom and obedience to his commands, only those can enjoy this world as a gift of the Creator and therefore as a channel for our worship. And this is my prayer for each of us as we walk through this book together, myself included. That we would see this book not as a book of pessimism, not as a book of fatalism, but that we would see this book of Ecclesiastes as a hopeful book, as one that addresses the challenges and realities of life in this sinful and broken and cursed world in such a way that we see that our trust in the things of this earth will only prove to be futile and meaninglessness, and that it will turn our eyes more and more to our Creator God, who is sovereign and in control of all things. You see, listen, the book of Ecclesiastes reminds us that the world is crooked. Things are not right. Sin runs rampant. You don't have to turn on the news very long at all to see that proven in our world today. You don't have to look at your own personal life very long to see the truth of that proven even this day. The world is broken, and there needs to be a reckoning to set things right. And Solomon in Ecclesiastes, as he concludes this book, says that there will be one. The final judgment is coming, he says. And it is a motivation for us to trust Christ and to obey him. You see, final judgment is what gives every one of our actions meaning in this cursed world. We will all be called to an account, even for the secret things, he says, whether good or evil, the things we think no one sees, the things we think no one else cares about. You see, the reality of Judgment Day is how the Good Shepherd cares for us as our flock, as his flock. In order to convict us, he goads us with the truth that we will be judged and we will be vindicated, or we will be punished. This is what the New Testament reveals as the purpose of God's law, the purpose of God's commandments, to reveal our sin to us, to convict us, and to lead us to Christ. You see, Solomon and all of his forefathers, all who came before him and all who descended after him, even unto you and I this very day, had the same problem. They failed and they broke the commandment of God, and they sought to find satisfaction and joy and pleasure in things other than God. And the consistent truth of God's word from beginning to end is that because we have done so, and because we continue to do so, each and every one of us will face judgment because of this. We will all be found to have fallen short. And listen, this reality is meant to crush us. This reality is meant to crush us, but it's not meant to leave us crushed. And that's a very important difference for us, isn't it? It's meant to crush us. It's meant to show us our sin and our utter unworthiness before God as sinners that we are. But it's not meant to leave us crushed, because it's meant to draw us and drive us to Christ. To drive us to the good news of what Christ has done in our place. Christ who lived that perfect life, who fulfilled that law in our place, who died that substitutionary death in our place, taking God's wrath as a payment in our place, who rose victoriously to defeat sin, death, and Satan in our behalf and on our behalf. You see, if you are outside of Christ this morning, if you are looking to the things of this earth, if you are striving after the things under the sun, my prayer for you this morning is that you would hear this, that you would come back, and that over the next 9 weeks, you would see Solomon lay bare the truth, that everything you're seeking after is vanity of vanities, and it will only lead to judgment and despair. And as you see that, whether you are outside of Christ or those of us who are in Christ, as we see that truth, as we're reminded of that truth, may we see the light of Christ. May we see him welcoming us with open arms. May we find the satisfaction and peace and joy and hope that are found in him and in him alone. And as we find that, then we find we can look out to everything in this world that we were seeking to find ultimate satisfaction in. We'll find that we can now look to those things and find joy in them, receive joy from them as we see them as good gifts from our Creator God that are meant to draw us back to worship God as the giver of all good gifts and the giver of all good things. So that is my prayer for you. That's my prayer for all of us this morning. As we end our time in God's Word this morning, and as we prepare to walk through this book verse by verse, may you see that everything is meaningless without Christ. Let's go to him now in prayer.